In the late 1960s, Betty Broderick appeared to live the ideal life, complete with a loving husband, a beautiful family, and a luxurious home in La Jolla, California. However, beneath this seemingly perfect surface lay a tumultuous relationship that would ultimately lead to a shocking tale of betrayal and revenge. In 1969, Betty married Daniel Broderick, a charismatic and ambitious man, and together they crafted what appeared to be the quintessential American dream. Dan, a promising medical malpractice attorney, was on the fast track to success, and Betty took on the role of a dutiful wife and mother, raising their 4 children while supporting Dan through years of medical and law school. Betty was more than just a partner. She was the backbone of their family. As Dan navigated the rigorous demands of his education and early career, Betty managed the household almost single-handedly. She juggled parenting, maintaining their home, and ensuring everything ran smoothly, all while putting her own dreams on hold. Despite the exhaustion, Betty remained committed to her husband and family, believing that their sacrifices would eventually pay off. As Dan's career flourished, so did their lifestyle. The couple reveled in the rewards of their success, living in an impressive home, enjoying country club memberships, and embarking on lavish vacations. Family gatherings at their spacious dining table were filled with laughter, and their friends often marveled at the Brodericks' idyllic life. From the outside looking in, they were the picture-perfect family that everyone aspired to be. But beneath this glossy exterior, tensions began to simmer. While Dan enjoyed the trappings of his success, Betty felt increasingly isolated and unfulfilled. She had sacrificed so much for their life together, yet as the years passed, her own identity and dreams faded into the background. The love that once united them began to fray as Dan became more consumed by his work and ambitions, leaving Betty feeling neglected and lonely. In the early 1980s, the idyllic facade of Betty and Dan Broderick's marriage began to show significant cracks. As Betty juggled the demands of motherhood and family life, her intuition started to whisper unsettling truths. She noticed subtle changes in Dan's behavior, long hours at the office, late-night meetings, and the increasingly frequent need for work-related trips. Each passing day filled Betty with growing unease, a gnawing feeling that something was deeply wrong in their marriage. Her suspicions soon zeroed in on Linda Kokina, Don's 21-year-old assistant, who had started working for him in 1983. Linda, with her youthful charm and vibrant energy, quickly captured Dan's attention. Betty found herself grappling with a mix of feelings, fear, anger, and a deep sense of betrayal. Linda represented everything Betty felt she had lost: her youth, her dreams, and her husband's love. The contrast between her own life and the carefree spirit of Linda became a painful reminder of Betty's sacrifices over the years. As Dan became more secretive, Betty's instincts kicked in. She began to piece together the puzzle of his infidelity, scrutinizing every detail of his day. Late-night phone calls, whispers behind closed doors, and sudden shifts in Don's schedule only fueled her paranoia. Each time she confronted him, he brushed aside her accusations, insisting that she was imagining things. "You're being paranoid, Betty," he would say dismissively. "You know how busy I am with work." The gaslighting left Betty feeling increasingly isolated and distraught, trapped in a marriage that was suffocating her spirit. By 1985, the dam of denial broke. The truth came crashing down when Dan finally admitted to the affair. In a cold, heart-wrenching conversation, he revealed that he had fallen in love with Linda and wanted a divorce. The words cut through Betty like a knife. This was not merely a betrayal of trust. It was an annihilation of the life they had built together. In that moment, everything she had sacrificed for Dan, the career she had put on hold, the dreams she had shelved, seemed to vanish in an instant. For Betty, this betrayal was compounded by the realization that Dan was leaving her for someone much younger. The woman who had once looked up to Betty as a mentor was now the object of her husband's affection. Betty's emotions swung violently between rage and despair as she grappled with the enormity of losing not just her husband, but her identity. She had dedicated her life to supporting Dan, sacrificing her own ambitions to raise their 4 children and nurture his career as he climbed the ranks to become a successful medical malpractice attorney. The fallout from Dan's betrayal was swift and brutal. Betty's world, once filled with promise, turned bitter and toxic. The man she had loved and trusted was now a stranger, pursuing a new life with Linda, while Betty felt trapped in a whirlwind of heartbreak and humiliation. Their home, once a sanctuary, morphed into a battleground of emotional conflict. Betty found herself increasingly alone, battling her growing insecurities and the anger that simmered beneath the surface. As Dan filed for divorce, he painted Betty as the unreasonable wife, further deepening her sense of betrayal. She was left not only to navigate the heartbreak of losing her husband, but also to face the legal battles that followed. The idyllic life she had envisioned was slipping through her fingers, replaced by the harsh reality of a looming divorce and the specter of her husband's new love. With each passing day, Betty felt the weight of her loss simmering in the shadows of her own home. Her dream of a perfect family shattered, replaced by a bitter reality that would ultimately push her towards a point of no return. The affair, once a painful whisper, had transformed into a deafening roar, consuming Betty's thoughts and driving her to the brink of an emotional collapse. The betrayal ignited a fire within her, one that would lead to devastating consequences for everyone involved. The divorce proceedings between Dan and Betty Broderick were nothing short of a war and all-consuming conflict that shattered their once cherished marriage and tore apart their family. Couple who had once shared dreams and built a life together found themselves on opposite sides of a bitter legal battle that would last for years, leaving emotional scars that would never heal. As Dan Broderick's career flourished, so did his influence and connections within the legal community. He had transitioned from a struggling attorney to a powerful figure in medical malpractice law, gaining respect and wealth along the way. With his newfound status came an air of arrogance. Dan wielded his legal prowess like a weapon, using it to gain the upper hand in their divorce. Betty, in stark contrast, found herself at a disadvantage. With her dreams of independence overshadowed by years of devotion to her husband and children, she had little knowledge of the financial and legal maneuvers Dan was capable of executing. Couples' once egalitarian partnership transformed into a one-sided affair where Dan dictated the terms. Dan's control over the couple's finances left Betty feeling powerless and destitute. He quickly positioned himself as the financial gatekeeper, ensuring that she had limited access to their shared resources. As the divorce proceedings dragged on, Betty was faced with mounting legal bills, and her financial independence seemed more like a distant fantasy. The legal system, which Betty had once believed would offer her protection and support, now felt like a harsh adversary. In court, Dan's polished legal strategy and charming demeanor won him favorable rulings at every turn. He was granted custody of their children, a decision that devastated Betty and stripped her of her role as a mother. In addition, Dan was awarded the family home, a sanctuary that had once symbolized their life together, leaving Betty with no choice but to move into smaller, less secure accommodations. As the court battles continued, Betty began to feel increasingly isolated. The emotional toll of the divorce weighed heavily on her. The very system that she had hoped would advocate for her now felt stacked against her. To make matters worse, Dan's legal team sought to portray Betty as mentally unstable, undermining her credibility in court and alienating her from her children. This characterization was a cruel twist of fate, deepening her sense of despair and loneliness. Betty's relationship with her children suffered as Don leveraged his custody rights to keep them away from her. She was desperate to maintain a connection with them, but felt her attempts thwarted at every turn. As Betty's emotional state deteriorated, her fixation on Dan and his new partner, Linda Colcana, intensified. Combination of betrayal, anger, and despair led her down a dangerous path. In her mind, the divorce was not just a legal battle, it was a personal vendetta against the man she had once loved and trusted. Betty began to engage in erratic behavior that shocked even those closest to her. She left venomous messages on Dan's answering machine, pouring out her rage and pain in a desperate attempt to communicate her suffering. The voicemail tapes became infamous, highlighting the raw emotions that consumed her. Her anger manifested in more destructive ways. In a fit of rage, she vandalized Dan's property, feeling a twisted sense of satisfaction as she unleashed her pent-up frustration. The culmination of her despair came when she drove her car into the front door of Dan's new home, a bold act of defiance that underscored her mental unraveling. As time passed, the battle seemed to be escalating without resolution. Betty found herself caught in a vicious cycle of anger, desperation, and hopelessness. Her obsession with Dan and Linda clouded her judgment, blurring the lines between rationality and vengeance. The contrast between her dreams for a happy family and the bleak reality of her situation only fueled her resentment further. The divorce, once a pathway to freedom, had become a nightmare that ensnared her in a web of emotional turmoil. With each passing day, Betty's hope for reconciliation dwindled, replaced by a burning desire for revenge against the man who had taken everything from her. As her mental state spiraled, the seeds of tragedy were sown, setting the stage for a confrontation that would change the course of their lives forever. The year is April 1989, and the sun shines brightly over La Jolla, California, casting a warm glow on what appears to be a perfect day. The lush gardens are in full bloom, and the air is filled with laughter and celebration. However, within the confines of a lavish wedding venue, a darker story unfolds: the wedding of Dan Broderick and his young assistant, Linda Colcana. This event marks a pivotal moment in the escalating drama between Betty Broderick and her estranged husband. As Dan and Linda exchange vows, Betty finds herself spiraling into an abyss of humiliation and despair. The opulent ceremony, adorned with elegant flowers and a glamorous guest list, becomes a stark reminder of everything Betty feels she has lost. In her eyes, Linda is not just Dan's new wife. She is the ultimate embodiment of betrayal. A young woman who represents the life Betty once had: the youth, the vitality, and the opportunities she sacrificed for her marriage and family. In that moment, Betty feels as though her entire identity has been stripped away, leaving behind only anger and heartache. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, Betty's emotional state has deteriorated dramatically. The profound sense of abandonment gnaws at her, and the reality of Dan's betrayal weighs heavily on her heart. She feels as if she's been cast aside, reduced to a mere shadow of the woman she once was. This is not just a divorce for Betty. It is a profound loss. The once loving home she built with Dan now feels like a prison, a constant reminder of what she has lost. Betty becomes consumed by thoughts of Dan and Linda's relationship, leading to increasingly erratic behavior. The emotional toll of the betrayal manifests in obsessive thoughts and actions. In a desperate attempt to regain control and make her voice heard, Betty begins stalking Dan and Linda. She drives by their home unannounced, watches them from a distance, and becomes fixated on their every move. Betty's behavior escalates to writing furious letters filled with accusations and rage, venting her feelings of betrayal and humiliation. Each letter is a cathartic release for her, but they also reflect her deep-seated pain and anger. Betty writes about her feelings of being discarded, the dreams she once held for her family, and the emotional toll the divorce has taken on her. In her mind, these letters are justified expressions of her anguish, but to Dan and Linda, they are harbingers of Betty's escalating instability. They become a source of fear and concern for both Dan and Linda as they navigate their new life together. Feeling increasingly threatened by Betty's obsessive behavior, Dan takes the significant step of filing a restraining order against her. This legal measure is an attempt to shield himself and Linda from Betty's emotional outbursts and erratic actions. However, the restraining order does little to quell Betty's anger. Instead, it deepens her feelings of isolation and despair. She perceives it as another layer of betrayal, a sign that Dan has completely severed ties with her and their life together. Betty's emotional state continues to spiral out of control as she grapples with the dual feelings of love and rage toward Dan. The more he distances himself, the more her obsession grows, creating a dangerous cycle of anger and grief. The wedding has not only solidified Dan's choice to move on, it has also ignited a fire within Betty, a fire that will lead to catastrophic consequences. On the morning of November 5, 1989, the tranquility of La Jolla, California, was shattered by a crime that would send shockwaves through the community and the nation. Betty Broderick, a woman once defined by her role as a devoted wife and mother, had reached a breaking point. Years of emotional trauma, betrayal, and heartbreak culminated in this fateful morning, where the line between sanity and madness blurred into a lethal resolve. As dawn broke, casting a pale light over the neighborhood, Betty drove to Dan and Linda's home, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. It was around 5:30 a.m. when she parked her car a short distance away, taking a moment to collect her thoughts. The sound of waves crashing against the shore faded into the background as her mind replayed the memories of betrayal, Dan's affair, the bitter divorce proceedings, and the countless nights spent grappling with feelings of inadequacy and rage. With a .38 caliber revolver concealed in her purse, she felt a sense of empowerment wash over her. This was not just about revenge. It was about reclaiming her life from the man who had turned it upside down. As she approached the house, her heart raced, not with fear, but with a chilling resolve. Entering the home she once shared with Dan, the silence was deafening. The walls, which had witnessed countless family moments, now felt like a trap. She made her way to the bedroom, her footsteps muffled on the plush carpet. Inside, Dan and Linda lay sleeping, blissfully unaware of the storm that was about to erupt. Without hesitation, Betty raised the revolver and fired 5 shots into the darkness. The sound of gunfire echoed through the house, a stark contrast to the peaceful suburban morning. Linda was killed instantly, her life snuffed out in a moment of blind rage. Dan, though fatally wounded, managed to comprehend the situation, his last words resonating with a haunting clarity. "Okay, you shot me. I'm dead." This chilling acknowledgement was a testament to the depths of betrayal he had inflicted on Betty, a woman who had once stood by him through thick and thin. In the aftermath, Betty's demeanor was disturbingly calm. As the chaos unfolded behind her, she walked out of the house, leaving behind the lifeless bodies of her husband and his new wife. The sun began to rise, casting a golden hue over the crime scene, a stark juxtaposition to the dark act that had just transpired. What followed was a harrowing scene that would forever etch itself into the annals of true crime history. The tranquility of La Jolla was replaced by the piercing sirens of law enforcement, the media frenzy that would ensue, and a trial that captivated the nation. Betty Broderick's act of vengeance, born from years of emotional neglect and betrayal, transformed her into a figure both feared and pitied, a woman whose story would serve as a cautionary tale about the destructive power of love and resentment. As the dust settled on that tragic morning, one question lingered. How could a devoted wife, driven to despair by betrayal, commit such an unthinkable act? The answer lies in the dark complexities of human relationships, where love can quickly turn into a weapon of deadly revenge. The trial of Betty Broderick became a national media sensation, capturing the attention of millions and igniting debates about domestic relationships, mental health, and the complexities of marital betrayal. It was a highly publicized courtroom drama that showcased not just the tragic events leading up to the murders of Dan Broderick and Linda Kokina, but also the emotional turmoil and psychological struggles Betty endured over the years. Betty's defense team crafted a narrative that aimed to depict her not as a cold-blooded murderer, but as a woman driven to her breaking point by years of emotional abuse, manipulation, and betrayal. They argued that Dan's actions, including his infidelity and subsequent marriage to Linda, had pushed Betty into a state of despair, rendering her incapable of rational thought during the incident. Betty's attorneys emphasized the psychological toll that Dan's behavior had taken on her. They presented evidence of her emotional breakdowns, showcasing how the relentless strain of the divorce and Dan's new relationship had shattered her mental health. They argued that Betty had been victimized by a powerful man who wielded his wealth and influence to control and manipulate her. They called upon family and friends to testify about Betty's demeanor leading up to the murders, painting a picture of a woman who felt isolated and trapped. Their testimonies highlighted moments of despair, anger, and hopelessness that Betty experienced as Dan systematically dismantled the life they had built together. Betty's defense painted her as a tragic figure, a woman who had sacrificed her dreams for her husband and children, only to be discarded like an old piece of furniture. Supporters rallied around this narrative, seeing her as a symbol of the plight of women in abusive relationships, drawing attention to the broader issues of domestic abuse and the societal pressures faced by women. They emphasized her role as a mother, stressing the deep love she had for her children, and how the situation had forced her to fight for their well-being in the face of overwhelming odds. This angle aimed to invoke sympathy from the jury, compelling them to see her actions as a desperate response to unbearable circumstances, rather than premeditated murder. In stark contrast, the prosecution aimed to portray Betty as a vengeful woman who had meticulously planned the murders of Dan and Linda. They argued that her actions were the result of a long history of obsessive behavior and a refusal to let go of a past she could not accept. The prosecution highlighted key pieces of evidence, including the fact that Betty had purchased the gun used in the murders months prior to the incident. They painted a picture of a woman who had carefully calculated her actions, suggesting that her emotional state had morphed into a dangerous obsession that culminated in a cold and deliberate act of violence. They detailed Betty's previous behavior, including instances of stalking and harassment, presenting these as evidence of her deteriorating mental state and vindictiveness. They argued that her obsessive love for Dan had turned into an all-consuming hatred, which ultimately led her to take the lives of 2 people. The prosecution sought to undermine Betty's victim narrative by portraying her as a person who could not accept defeat. They argued that she was angry at losing control over her life and her family, resorting to murder as a way to reclaim that control. They presented her as a manipulative figure, attempting to gain sympathy while ultimately being responsible for her actions. Witnesses for the prosecution included friends and acquaintances who described Betty's erratic behavior following Dan's marriage to Linda. They argued that her inability to cope with her new reality showcased a dangerous mindset that had been building over the years. The trial was marked by intense media scrutiny, with journalists and spectators drawn to the courtroom to witness the unfolding drama. The jury deliberated for days, but ultimately resulted in a hung jury, leading to a mistrial. The sensationalism surrounding the case fueled public interest, sparking debates about domestic violence, mental health, and the justice system. However, the second trial in 1991 saw a different outcome. After examining the evidence and hearing the testimonies, the jury found Betty guilty of 2 counts of second-degree murder. The prosecution's portrayal of her as a woman who had crossed the line into premeditated violence resonated with the jury, overshadowing her defense's narrative of victimhood and emotional turmoil. Betty Broderick was sentenced to 32 years to life in prison, a verdict that shocked many who had followed the case. While some viewed her as a tragic figure pushed to her limits, others saw her as a woman who made a choice to commit an unthinkable act. The sentence marked the end of a harrowing chapter in her life, but it also opened the door for ongoing discussions about the impacts of emotional abuse, the complexities of marital relationships, and the failings of the legal system to protect individuals in similar situations. The case of Betty Broderick stands as one of the most iconic and controversial true crime stories in American history. What began as a narrative of marital betrayal quickly escalated into a complex saga involving love, loss, and ultimate revenge, capturing the public's attention and igniting a nationwide debate about the intricacies of relationships and the emotional toll of divorce. Betty's story has inspired numerous books, documentaries, and dramatizations, most notably the TV miniseries Dirty John, The Betty Broderick Story, which brought renewed interest to the case. This series portrayed not only the events leading to the tragic murders, but also offered a glimpse into Betty's psyche, showcasing her as a woman who felt cornered and betrayed. Through these portrayals, audiences have gained insight into the psychological complexities of Betty's character, reflecting the broader societal issues surrounding marriage and divorce. The public's perception of Betty is deeply polarized. For some, she embodies the archetype of the wronged woman, driven to the edge by emotional turmoil and betrayal. Advocates for Betty argue that her actions were a desperate cry for justice in a system that seemed to favor her husband and dismiss her grievances. They highlight the years of emotional abuse and neglect she endured during her marriage, viewing her as a victim of circumstance rather than a villain.